Chapter 17. Rooftop Escape. In a jiffy, Nancy was out of bed and putting on robe and slippers. She dashed into the room where Bess and George were sleeping and woke them. "What's up?" George asked. "The bell rang," Nancy whispered. "Come on, hurry." She was more than halfway up the attic steps before the girls overtook her. Nancy beamed her flashlight into every dark corner of the attic, since the overhead light was a dim one. No one was hiding there. "Maybe when the tapper heard the bell," Bess suggested. "It scared him and he went back out the window. Let's see if he's hanging on." They rushed over and looked out. There was no sign of an intruder. "Of course he had plenty of time to get down," George remarked. Nancy reminded the others it was a pretty precarious climb hanging onto a vertical wall. It couldn't be done quickly. "Right," said Bess. "And I don't see how he could do it anyway." Puzzled, the girls gazed across the roof. They could see only part of it, since the house had two gables. The moon was shining and everything stood out clearly. Suddenly, George grabbed Nancy's arm. "Look, over by the chimney! There he goes!" For a few seconds, a pudgy figure was silhouetted on a far peak. Then it disappeared. "We can catch him yet," Nancy exclaimed. "He can't get down as fast as we can." She led the way downstairs, 2 steps at a time. The girls dashed to the first floor and outside. Taking opposite directions, they raced around the house, all the time looking upward for the climbing figure. In the bright moonlight, they could not have missed anyone descending from the roof, yet no person was visible. "He's gone again," Bess wailed. "I don't fancy running into somebody dangerous, but just the same, I'd like to know who the climber is and how he gets up and down." At that moment, they heard a motor start and hurried to the street. A car, which was not the Bunces, pulled away from in front of their house with a roar. The driver, who had no passenger, held a hand over the side of his face so he could not be identified. He suddenly turned out his lights, making it impossible for the girls to read his license number. "Now who was he?" George asked. "Perhaps Fred Bunce came back for more of his things." "I doubt it," Bess replied. "He must know by now that the police are looking for him. He wouldn't dare come here." "It might have been the pudgy man we saw on the roof," Nancy remarked. "What do we do now?" Bess asked. Nancy said she was going to alert the police. 2 officers arrived in a little while, and Nancy briefed them on the details of the man who had been on the roof and escaped. The police made a thorough search of the entire house, even the secret room, which Nancy showed them. "Man alive! What a prison!" one of the officers exclaimed. "Staying in here for any length of time is enough to drive a person crazy, even if he didn't start that way." Nancy made no comment. At times, she felt sorry for Gus Woonton and figured that if he had had psychiatric help as a child, he might not have turned out the way he had. It may not be too late, she thought, but kept the supposition to herself. Finally, the 2 officers, convinced that the intruder had gone, said they must leave but would check the house again in about an hour. "If you hear anybody in the meantime, let us know," one said. The commotion had awakened Miss Carter and Mrs. Beeling, who wanted to know what had happened. They were given a full report. At the end, Nancy said, "Unfortunately, we've learned almost nothing. But the tapper, or whoever got into the attic, knows by now we've rigged up a way to snare him. So I figure there's a good chance he won't be back." Actually, Nancy said this to allay the woman's fears, but deep in her heart she did not believe it. Anyone as determined as the tapper would return. Finally, everyone went to bed for the second time that night. There was absolute silence in the house. Nancy did not drop off to sleep at once. Suddenly, she jumped from the bed and started for the hall doorway. She had heard tapping heel sounds on the 2nd floor. By the time Nancy reached the hall, the tapping had stopped. She waited. There was not a sound. An eerie feeling came over Nancy, as if she were being watched by unseen eyes. The young sleuth stood still for a long time, but there was not another sound either from the second floor or anywhere else in the house. I couldn't have dreamed hearing the tapping, she thought, going back to her room and dropping into bed. Nancy did not get much rest that night. The mystery had begun to disturb her. She felt she was getting nowhere in solving it. Finally, utterly weary, Nancy fell asleep. She had promised to take Mrs. Beeling to River Heights early in the morning so the woman could spend Sunday at home. Nancy was up, bathed, and dressed before anyone else was ready. Bess and George had promised to care for Miss Carter while her nurse was gone. They planned to hurry with the housework because in the afternoon their Emerson College friends, Bert Eddleton and Dave Evans, would arrive and stay to supper. Ned had told Nancy he would come to her house by bus, and the two would drive to Berryville in her car. "I'll ride back to Emerson with the boys," he had said. Before Nancy and Mrs. Beeling left, Miss Carter again thanked them for all they had done. "I'll try not to be any trouble to Bess and George," she said. "If they get too lonesome, I'll try to cheer them up by quoting a few humorous lines from plays I've been in." "That'll be great," Bess replied with a giggle. She felt unusually happy this morning. It was a clear day, and birds were singing cheerily. She had succeeded in playing Cupid for Toby Simpson and Miss Carter, and in a few hours her favorite date would arrive. "You look," George said to her cousin, "like a satisfied cat who has just finished off a poor mouse." "Yes? Well, how about you doing a little grinning?" Bess retorted. "Bert'll like that." Nancy and Mrs. Beeling said goodbye and left the house. As they rode along, Mrs. Beeling said, "This is a beautiful morning, isn't it? We're having special services at our church. I'm so glad Miss Carter gave me the day off." Suddenly she asked Nancy, "Do you always go to church?" "As often as I can," she replied. "This morning Dad and Hannah and I will go to service together." "That's nice." When Nancy reached home, Mrs. Gruen insisted that she have a second breakfast, at least some of her homemade coffee cake. Nancy laughed. "I can't very well refuse that, although I did eat a big breakfast." After church, Nancy helped with dinner preparations, and by 1 o'clock she and her father and Mrs. Gruen were sitting down to a delicious meal of roast lamb, mashed potatoes, fresh peas, and strawberry shortcake. "Marvelous dinner," Mr. Drew said. Directly afterward, Nancy put the plates, glasses, and silver into the dishwasher. Meanwhile, the housekeeper had begun preparations for a cold supper, which Nancy would take with her. By this time, Mrs. Gruen knew the favorite foods of the 3 boys who were coming to Miss Carter's. "This evening, there'll be chicken sandwiches, sliced tomatoes, and apple pie with ice cream," she announced. "Perfect," said Nancy. An hour later, the telephone rang. Mr. Drew answered. He talked a long while and then came out to the kitchen. "That call was from St. Louis," he said. "Here's big news. As soon as the Woonton estate was settled, and there were no complications, W.F. Bunce, the money, and the stocks and bonds vanished." "Oh dear!" Nancy exclaimed. "Does this mean he stole them?" The lawyer shrugged. "It certainly makes everything harder to figure out." Nancy knit her brow. If Bunce stole them, why did he take a chance on getting caught by ignoring the Beverly? It seems to me it would have been smarter if he had paid Gus Woonton's board. Then no one would have become suspicious. "You're absolutely right, Nancy," her father agreed. "And this also doesn't explain why, if Miss Carter's neighbor is W.F. Bunce, he came to live in Berryville, where the old Woonton house is. According to the reports, there was a lot of money in the estate, and I should have thought he would have gone as far away as possible." The discussion was interrupted by loud banging on the kitchen door. Nancy opened it. Her young friend, Tommy Johnson, was standing there. His eyes were large, and he was so excited he could hardly talk. He stuttered and stammered something unintelligible. "What is it, Tommy?" Nancy asked. "Say it slowly." The little boy pointed toward the garage. I just saw a man sneak out of there, and now I can hear something ticking. End of chapter 17.